the Phoenix Theater and Arts Company's audio drama series presents Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Part 4, adapted and directed by Jenna Isabella. For past episodes, upcoming events, and other information, make sure to visit our website at phoenixtheaterartsco.com. That's theater with an R-E. Without further ado, we give you Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Part 4.
Chapter 10. The Lobster Quadrille. The Mock Turtle sighed deeply and drew the back of one flipper across his eyes. He looked at Alice and tried to speak, but for a minute or two, sobs choked his voice.
"Same as if he had a bone in his throat,"
said the Gryphon, and it set to work shaking him and punching him in the back. At last the Mock Turtle recovered his voice, and with tears running down his cheeks, he went on again.
"You may not have lived much under the sea.
I haven't.
And perhaps you were never even introduced to a lobster.
I once tasted... no, never.
So, you can have no idea what a delightful thing a lobster quadrille is.
No, indeed. What sort of dance is it?
Why, you first form into a line along the seashore.
2 lines,
cried the Mock Turtle.
Seals, turtles, salmon, and so on. Then, when you've cleared all the jellyfish out of the way,
That generally takes some time.
you advance twice.
Each with a lobster as a partner.
Of course, advance twice, set 2 partners.
Change lobsters and retire in same order.
Then, you throw the
lobsters!
as far out to sea as you can.
Swim after them!
Turn a somersault in the sea.
Change lobsters again!
Back to land again, and that's all the first figure.
And the 2 creatures, who had been jumping about like mad things all this time, sat down again very sadly and quietly and looked at Alice.
It must be a very pretty dance.
Would you like to see a little of it?
Very much indeed.
Come, let's try the first figure. We can do without lobsters, Which shall we sing?
Oh, you sing. I've forgotten the words.
So they began solemnly dancing round and round Alice, every now and then treading on her toes when they passed too close, and waving their forepaws to mark the time, while the Mock Turtle sang this, very slowly and sadly.
Will you walk a little faster? Said the whiting to a snail. There's a porpoise close behind us, and he's treading on my tail. See how eagerly the lobsters and the turtles all advance. They are waiting on the shingle. Will you come and join the dance? Will you, won't you? Will you, won't you? Will you join the dance? Will you, won't you? Will you, won't you? Won't you join the dance? You can really have no notion how delightful it will be when they take us up and throw us with the lobsters out to sea. But the snail replied, too far, and gave a look askance. Said he thanked the whiting kindly, but he would not join the dance. Would not, could not, would not, could not, would not join the dance. Would not, could not, would not, could not join the dance. What matters it how far we go, his scaly friend replied. There is another shore, you know, upon the other side. The further off from England, the nearer is to France. Then turn not pale, beloved snail, but come and join the dance. Will you, won't you, will you, won't you, will you join the dance? Will you, won't you, will you, won't you join the dance?
Thank you. It's a very interesting dance to watch. And I do so like that curious song about the whiting fish.
Oh, as to the whiting fish, you've seen them, of course.
Yes, I've often seen them at
I don't know where Din may be, but you've seen them so often. Of course you know what they're like.
I believe so. They have their tails in their mouths and they're all over crumbs.
You're wrong about the crumbs. Crumbs would all wash off in the sea. But they have their tails in their mouths, and the reason is...
Here the Mock Turtle yawned and shut his eyes.
Tell her about the reason and all that.
The reason is that they would go with the lobsters to the dance. So they got thrown out to sea. So they had to fall a long way. So they got their tails fast in their mouths so they couldn't get them out again. That's all.
Thank you. It's very interesting. I never knew so much about a whiting before.
I can tell you more than that if you like. Do you know why it's called a whiting?
I never thought about it. Why?
It does the boots and shoes.
Alice was thoroughly puzzled.
Does the boots and shoes?
She repeated in a wondering tone.
Why, what are your shoes done with? I mean, what makes them so shiny?
Alice looked down at them and considered a little before she gave her answer.
They're done with blacking, I believe.
Boots and shoes under the sea are done with a whiting. Now you know.
And what are they made of?
Soles and eels, of course. Any shrimp could have told you that.
If I'd been the whiting, I'd have said to the porpoise, "Keep back, please. We don't want you with us."
They were obliged to have him with them. No wise fish would go anywhere without a porpoise.
Wouldn't it really?
Of course not. Why, if a fish came to me and told me he was going a journey, I should say with what porpoise?
Don't you mean purpose?
I mean what I say.
Come, let's hear some of your adventures.
I could tell you my adventures beginning from this morning. But it's no use going back to yesterday because I was a different person then.
Explain all that.
No, the adventures first. Explanations take such a dreadful time.
So Alice began telling them her adventures from the time when she first saw the white rabbit. She was a little nervous about it, just at first, and the two creatures got so close to her, one on each side, and opened their eyes and mouths so very wide. But she gained courage as she went on. Her listeners were perfectly quiet till she got to the part about her repeating
You are old, Father William.
to the caterpillar, and the words all coming different. And then the Mock Turtle drew a long breath and said,
That's very curious.
It's about as curious as it can be.
It all came different. I should like to hear her try and repeat something now. Tell her to begin.
He looked at the griffin as if he thought it had some kind of authority over Alice.
Stand up and repeat. 'Tis the voice of the sluggard.
How the creatures order one about and make one repeat lessons.
thought Alice.
I might as well be at school at once.
However, she got up and began to repeat it, but her head was so full of the lobster quadrille that she hardly knew what she was saying, and the words came very queer indeed.
'Tis the voice of the lobster, I heard him declare. You have baked me too brown, I must sugar my hair. As a duck with its eyelids, so he with his nose trims his belt and his buttons and turns out his toes.
That's different from what I used to say when I was a child.
Well, I never heard it before, but it sounds uncommon nonsense.
Alice said nothing. She had sat down with her face in her hands, wondering if anything would ever happen in a natural way again.
I should like to have it explained.
She can't explain it. Go on with the next verse.
But about his toes, how could he turn them out with his nose, you know?
It's the first position in dancing.
Alice said, but was dreadfully puzzled by the whole thing and longed to change the subject.
Go on with the next verse. It begins. I passed by his garden.
Alice did not dare to disobey, though she felt sure it would all come wrong, and she went on in a trembling voice.
I passed by his garden and marked with one eye how the owl and the panther were sharing a pie.
What is the use of repeating all that stuff? If you don't explain it as you go on, it's by far the most confusing thing I ever heard.
Yes, I think you'd better leave it off,
said the Gryphon, and Alice was only too glad to do so.
Shall we try another figure of the lobster quadrille? Or would you like the mock turtle to sing you a song?
Oh, a song, please, if the mock turtle would be so kind.
No accounting for tastes. Sing her Turtle Soup, will you, old fellow?
The mock turtle sighed deeply and began, in a voice sometimes choked with sobs, to sing this.
Beautiful soup, so rich and green, waiting in a hot tureen. Who for such dainties would not stoop? Soup of the evening, beautiful soup. Soup of the evening, beautiful soup. Beautiful soup. Beautiful soup. Soup of the evening. Beautiful soup.
Chorus again!
Beautiful soup.
The trial's beginning!
Cried a voice in the distance.
Come on!
Shouted the Gryphon, and taking Alice by the hand, it hurried off without waiting for the end of the song.
What trial is it?
Alice panted as she ran, but the Gryphon only answered,
Come on!
and ran faster, while more and more faintly came, carried on the breeze that followed them, the melancholy words.
Soup of the evening. Beautiful. Beautiful soup.
Chapter 11. Who Stole the Tarts? The King and Queen of Hearts were seated on their throne when they arrived, with a great crowd assembled about them, all sorts of little birds and beasts, as well as the whole pack of cards. The knave was standing before them in chains, with a soldier on each side to guard him, and near the king was the White Rabbit, with a trumpet in one hand and a scroll of parchment in the other. In the very middle of the court was a table, with a large dish of tarts upon it. They looked so good that it made Alice quite hungry to look at them, and she thought,
I wish they'd get the trial done and hand round the refreshments.
But there seemed to be no chance of this, so she began looking at everything about her to pass away the time. Alice had never been in a court of justice before, but she had read about them in books, and she was quite pleased to find that she knew the name of nearly everything there. She said to herself,
That's the judge because of his great wig.
The judge, by the way, was the king, and as he wore his crown over the wig, he did not look at all comfortable, and it was certainly not becoming.
And that's the jury box, and those the 12 creatures.
She was obliged to say creatures, you see, because some of them were animals and some were birds.
I suppose they are the jurors?
She said this last word 2 or 3 times over to herself,
Jurors?
being rather proud of it,
Jurors.
for she thought, and
Jurors.
rightly too, that very few little girls of her age knew the meaning of it at all. The 12 jurors were all writing very busily on slates.
What are they doing?
Alice whispered to the Griffin.
They can't have anything to put down yet before the trial's begun.
They're putting down their names, for fear they should forget them before the end of the trial.
Stupid things.
Just then, the White Rabbit cried out,
Silence in the court!
and the king put on his spectacles and looked anxiously round to make out who was talking. Alice could see, as well as if she were looking over their shoulders, that all the jurors were writing down stupid things on their slates, and she could even make out that one of them didn't know how to spell stupid and that he had to ask his neighbor to tell him.
A nice muddle of their slates will be in before the trial's over.
Thought Alice. One of the jurors had a pencil that squeaked. This, of course, Alice could not stand, and she went round the court and got behind him, and very soon found the opportunity of taking it away. She did it so quickly that the poor little juror, it was Bill, the lizard, could not make out at all what had become of it. So, after hunting all about for it, he was obliged to write with one finger for the rest of the day, and this was of very little use, as it left no mark on the slate.
Herald, read the accusation,
Said the king. On this, the White Rabbit blew 3 blasts of the trumpet, and then unrolled the parchment scroll, and read as follows.
The Queen of Hearts, she made some tarts, all on a summer day. The Knave of Hearts, he stole those tarts, and took them quite away.
Consider your verdict.
The king said to the jury.
Not yet! There's a great deal to come before that.
Call the first witness,
Said the king, and the White Rabbit blew 3 blasts on the trumpet, and called out.
First witness!
The first witness was the Hatter. He came in with a teacup in one hand, and a piece of bread and butter in the other.
I beg your pardon, your majesty, for bringing these in, but I hadn't quite finished my tea when I was sent for.
You ought to have finished. When did you begin?
The Hatter looked at the March Hare, who had followed him into the court, arm in arm with the Dormouse.
14th of March, I think it was.
15th?
Replied the March Hare.
16th.
Added the Dormouse.
Write that down.
The king said to the jury, and the jury eagerly wrote down all 3 dates on their slates, and then added them up, and reduced the answer to shillings and pence.
Take off your hat.
The king said to the Hatter, to which the Hatter replied.
It isn't mine.
Stolen!
The king exclaimed, turning to the jury, who instantly made a memorandum of the fact.
I keep them to sell. I've none of my own. I'm a hatter.
Here the queen put on her spectacles and began staring at the Hatter, who turned rather pale and fidgeted.
Give your evidence, and don't be nervous, or I'll have you executed on the spot.
This did not seem to encourage the witness at all. He kept shifting from one foot to the other, looking uneasily at the queen, and in his confusion he bit a large piece out of his teacup instead of the bread and butter. Just at this moment, Alice felt a very curious sensation, which puzzled her a good deal until she made out what it was. She was beginning to grow larger again, and she thought at first that she should get up and leave the court, but on second thought she decided to remain where she was as long as there was room for her.
I wish you wouldn't squeeze so.
Said the Dormouse, who was sitting next to her.
I can hardly breathe.
I can't help it, I'm growing.
You've no right to grow here.
Don't talk nonsense. You know you're growing too.
Yes, but I grow at a reasonable pace, not in that ridiculous fashion.
And he got up very sulkily and crossed over to the other side of the court. All this time the queen had never left off staring at the Hatter, and just as the Dormouse crossed the court, she said to one of the officers,
Bring me the list of the singers in the last concert.
on which the wretched Hatter trembled so that he shook both his shoes off.
Give your evidence, or I'll have you executed, whether you're nervous or not.
I am a poor man, your majesty, and I hadn't begun my tea. Not above a week or so. And what with the bread and butter getting so thin, and the twinkling of the tea.
The twinkling of the what?
It began with the tea.
Of course twinkling begins with a T. Do you take me for a dunce? Go on.
I'm a poor man, and most things twinkled after that. Only the March Hare said...
I didn't.
You did?
I deny it.
He denies it. Leave out that part.
Well, at any rate, the Dormouse said...
The Hatter went on, looking anxiously around to see if he would deny it too. But the Dormouse denied nothing, being fast asleep.
After that, I cut up some more bread and butter.
But what did the Dormouse say?
That... I can't remember.
You must remember, or I'll have you executed.
The miserable Hatter dropped his teacup and bread and butter and went down on one knee.
I am a poor man, your majesty.
You're a very poor speaker.
Here, one of the guinea pigs cheered and was immediately suppressed by the officers of the court. As that is rather a hard word, I will just explain to you how it was done. They had a large canvas bag, which tied up at the mouth with strings. Into this they slipped the guinea pig, head first, and then sat upon it. Alice thought to herself,
I'm glad I've seen that done. I've so often read in the newspapers at the end of trials, there were some attempts at applause which was immediately suppressed by the officers of the court, and I never understood what it meant until now.
If that's all you know about it, you may stand down.
I can't go no lower. I'm on the floor as it is.
Then you may sit down.
Oh.
Here, the other guinea pig cheered and was suppressed.
Come, that finished the guinea pigs. Now we shall get on better.
I'd rather finish my tea.
Said the Hatter, with an anxious look at the Queen, who was reading the list of singers.
You may go.
Stated the King, and the Hatter hurriedly left the court, without even waiting to put his shoes on.
And just take his head off outside.
The Queen added to one of the officers, but the Hatter was out of sight before the officer could get to the door.
Call the next witness.
The next witness was the Duchess's cook. She carried the pepper box in her hand, and Alice guessed who it was even before she got into the court by the way the people near the door began sneezing all at once.
Give your evidence.
Shan't!
The King looked anxiously at the White Rabbit, who said in a low voice,
Your Majesty, we must cross-examine this witness.
Well, if I must, I must.
and after folding his arms and frowning at the cook till his eyes were nearly out of sight, he said in a deep voice,
What are tarts made of?
Pepper! Mostly.
Treacle.
Collar that dormouse. Behead that dormouse. Turn the dormouse out of court. Suppress him. Pinch him. Off with his whiskers.
For some minutes the whole court was in confusion, getting the dormouse turned out, and by the time they had settled down again, the cook had disappeared,
Never mind. Call the next witness.
and he added in an undertone to the Queen,
Really, my dear, you must cross-examine the next witness. It quite makes my forehead ache.
Alice watched the White Rabbit as he fumbled over the list, feeling very curious to see what the next witness would be like.
For they haven't got much evidence yet.
She said to herself. Imagine her surprise when the White Rabbit read out at the top of his shrill little voice the name
Alice!
Chapter 12. Alice's Evidence.
Here.
Cried Alice, quite forgetting in the flurry of the moment how large she had grown in the last few minutes. And she jumped up in such a hurry that she tipped over the jury box with the edge of her skirt, upsetting all the jurors onto the heads of the crowd below. And there they lay, sprawling about, reminding her very much of a globe of goldfish she had accidentally upset the week before.
Oh, I beg your pardon.
She began picking them up again as quickly as she could, for a former accident with goldfish kept running through her head, and she had a vague sort of idea that they must be collected at once and put back into the jury box, or they would die.
The trial cannot proceed until all the jurymen are back in their proper places. All.
The king repeated with great emphasis, looking hard at Alice as he said so. Alice looked at the jury box and saw that in her haste she had put the lizard in head downwards, and the poor little thing was waving its tail about in a melancholy way, being quite unable to move. She soon got it out again and put it right, and said to herself,
Not that it signifies much. I should think it would be quite as much use in the trial one way up as the other.
As soon as the jury had a little recovered from the shock of being so upset, and their slates and pencils had been found and handed back to them, they set to work very diligently to write out a history of the accident, all except Bill the lizard, who seemed too much overcome to do anything but sit with its mouth open, gazing up into the roof of the court.
What do you know about this business?
Nothing.
Nothing whatever?
Nothing whatever.
That's very important.
The king said, turning to the jury. They were just beginning to write this down on their slates when the White Rabbit interrupted.
Unimportant, Your Majesty. Of course.
Unimportant. Of course, I meant.
The king hastily said.
Important, unimportant, unimportant, important.
He continued as if he were trying which word sounded the best. Some of the jury wrote it down as important, and some as unimportant. Alice could see this as she was near enough to look over their slates.
But it doesn't matter a bit.
She thought to herself. At this moment the king, who had been for some time busily writing in his notebook, cried out,
Silence!
And read from his book.
Rule 42. All persons more than a mile high to leave the court.
Everybody looked at Alice.
I'm not a mile high.
You are.
Nearly 2 miles high.
Well, I shan't go at any rate. Besides, that's not a regular rule. You've invented it just now.
It's the oldest rule in the book.
Then it ought to be number 1.
The king turned pale and shut his notebook hastily. He looked at the jury box.
Consider your verdict.
There's more evidence to come yet. Please, Your Majesty. This paper has just been picked up.
What's in it?
I haven't opened it yet. But it seems to be a letter written by the prisoner to somebody.
It must have been that. Unless it was written to nobody, which isn't unusual, you know. Who is it directed to?
It isn't directed at all. In fact, there's nothing written on the outside.
He unfolded the paper as he spoke and added,
It isn't a letter, after all. It's a set of verses.
Are they in the prisoner's handwriting?
No, they're not. And that's the queerest thing about it.
He must have imitated somebody else's hand.
Please, Your Majesty, I didn't write it, and they can't prove I did. There's no name signed at the end.
If you didn't sign it, that only makes the matter worse. You must have meant some mischief, or else you'd have signed your name like an honest man.
There was a general clapping of hands at this. It was the first really clever thing the king had said that day.
That proves his guilt.
It proves nothing of the sort. Why, you don't even know what they're about.
Read them!
The White Rabbit put on his spectacles.
Where shall I begin, please, Your Majesty?
Begin at the beginning, and go on till you have come to the end. Then stop.
These were the verses the White Rabbit read.
They told me you had been her, and mentioned me to him. She gave me a good character, but said I could not swim. He sent them word I had not gone. We know it to be true. If she should put the matter on, what would become of you? I gave her 1, I gave her 2. You gave us 3 or more. They all returned from him to you, though they were mine before. If I or she should chance to be involved in this affair, he trusts to you to set them free, exactly as we were. My notion was that you had been, before she had this fit, an obstacle that came between him and ourselves and it. Don't let him know she liked them best. For this must ever be a secret kept from all the rest, between yourself and me.
That's the most important piece of evidence we've heard yet. So, now let the jury...
If any one of them can explain it.
said Alice. She had grown so large in the last few minutes that she wasn't a bit afraid of interrupting him.
I'll give him 6 pence. I don't believe there's an atom of meaning in it.
The jury all wrote down on their slates, she doesn't believe there's an atom of meaning in it. But none of them attempted to explain the paper.
If there's no meaning in it, that saves a world of trouble, you know, as we needn't try to find any. And yet, I don't know. I seem to see some meaning in them after all. Said I could not swim. You can't swim, can you?
The king added, turning to the knave. The knave shook his head sadly.
Do I look like it?
The knave said, which he certainly did not, being made entirely of cardboard.
All right, so far. We know it to be true. That's the jury, of course. I gave her 1, they gave him 2. Why? That must be what he did with the tarts, you know.
But it goes on. They all return from him to you.
Why, there they are!
He pointed to the tarts on the table. Then he said to the queen,
Nothing can be clearer than that. Then again, before she had this fit, you've never had fits, my dear, I think.
Never.
said the queen, throwing an inkstand at the lizard as she spoke. The unfortunate little Bill had left off writing on his slate with 1 finger, as he found it made no mark. But now he hastily began again, using the ink that was trickling down his face for as long as it lasted.
Then the words don't fit you.
The king said, looking round the court with a smile. There was a dead silence,
It's a pun.
and everybody laughed.
Let the jury consider their verdict.
The king said, for about the 20th time that day.
No, sentence first, verdict afterwards.
Stuff and nonsense. The idea of having the sentence first.
Hold your tongue.
I won't.
Off with her head.
Nobody moved,
Who cares for you?
said Alice. She had grown to her full size by this time.
You're nothing but a pack of cards.
At this, the whole pack rose up into the air and came flying down upon her. She gave a little scream, half of fright and half of anger, and tried to beat them away, and found herself lying on the bank, with her head in the lap of her sister, who was gently brushing away some dead leaves that had fluttered down from the trees upon her face.
Wake up, Alice dear.
Said her sister.
Why, what a long sleep you've had.
Oh, I've had such a curious dream.
Cried Alice, and she told her sister, as well as she could remember them, all these strange adventures of hers that you've just been hearing about. And when she had finished, her sister kissed her and said,
It was a curious dream, dear, certainly. But now run in to your tea. It's getting late.
So Alice got up and ran off, thinking while she ran, as well she might, what a wonderful dream it had been. But her sister sat still just as she left her, leaning her head on her hand, watching the setting sun, and thinking of little Alice and all of her wonderful adventures, till she too began dreaming after a fashion, and this was her dream. First she dreamed of little Alice herself, and once again the tiny hands were clasped upon her knee, and the bright, eager eyes were looking up into hers. She could hear the very tones of her voice, and see that strange little toss of her head to keep back the wandering hair that would always get into her eyes. And still she listened, or seemed to listen, and the whole place around her became alive with strange creatures from her little sister's dream. The long grass rustled at her feet as the white rabbit hurried by. The frightened mouse splashed his way through the neighboring pool. She could hear the rattle of the teacups as the March Hare and his friends shared their never-ending meal, and the shrill voice of the queen ordering off her unfortunate guests to execution. Once more the pig baby was sneezing on the Duchess's knee, while plates and dishes crashed around it. Once more the shriek of the griffin, the squeaking of the lizard's slate pencil, and the choking of the suppressed guinea pigs filled the air, mixed up with the distant sobs of the miserable, sad mock turtle. So she sat on, with closed eyes, and half believed herself in Wonderland, though she knew she had but to open them again, and all would change to dull reality. The grass would be only rustling in the wind, and the pool rippling to the waving of the reeds. The rattling teacups would change to tinkling sheep bells, and the queen's shrill cries to the voice of the shepherd boy, and the sneeze of the baby, the shriek of the griffin, and all the other queer noises would change, she knew, to the confused clamor of the busy farmyard, while the lowing of the cattle in the distance would take the place of the mock turtle's heavy sobs. Lastly, she pictured to herself how this same little sister of hers would, in the aftertime, be herself a grown woman, and how she would keep through all her riper years the simple and loving heart of her childhood, and how she would gather about her other little children, and make their eyes bright and eager with many a strange tale, perhaps even with the dream of Wonderland of long ago, and how she would feel with all their simple sorrows, and find a pleasure in all their simple joys, remembering her own child life and the happy summer days. The end.
PTAC's audio drama series is a production by the Phoenix Theater and Arts Company. This week's episode, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland Part 4, was written by Lewis Carroll, adapted and directed by Jenna Isabella, and edited by Gina Stanton. This episode features the vocal talents of Amanda Booth as the Dormouse, the Queen of Hearts, and the Mock Turtle, Jenna Isabella as the voice in the distance, the March Hare and Alice's sister, John Isabella as the Rabbit, the Hatter, the Duchess's cook, and the Knave, Phil Pinot as the King and the Griffin, Gina Stanton as the narrator, and Sam Steer as Alice. Original PTAC music by Brian Sanishin. For a full listing of credits, visit us at phoenixtheaterartsco.com. That's theater with an R-E. While you're there, please consider clicking the donate link. That would be delightful. Have comments or questions? Email us at phoenixtheaterartsco@gmail.com or find us on social media. A very special thank you to our Patreon subscribers, with a shout out to those sitting in the box seats, Ken Shelby, and onstage seating, Margaret Thurston. We couldn't do this without you. Join us next week for The Gift of the Magi.